Hi there. Continuing a series of Socialism's Better Scientifically, a host of videos you should watch for more statistical detail here, let's take another deep look into just how socialism was and is superior, and why. Addendum. This will span a large area, time frame, and scope of various nations. Use common sense, there's a lot more to say, but time is sadly limited. None of the countries mentioned are by any means perfect, but they managed to achieve significant feats despite economic sanctions, diplomatic vilification, military aggression, civil wars or threats of invasion, and even internal mismanagement. I can go on and on. Before we look at examples of socialist nations increasing living standards, I want to make something clear. All the nations I'll bring up were instrumental in consistently achieving better quality of life outcomes than capitalist ones. And this is according to the World Bank's own data. This is in spite of socialist statistical bureaus documenting unfavorable trends, like rising mortality, while capitalist nations, including the US, underreported critical health metrics. Discrepancies appeared after World War II, as socialist states, emerging from the war, prioritized universal healthcare, literacy campaigns, and attempted to ensure equitable outcomes. For developing nations, these policies proved transformative by mitigating their relative poverty in ways capitalist systems can't. There's a whole host of lazy or otherwise incorrect retorts to the above, from false socialist statistics to more esoteric forms of cope, but I've dealt with those in a now ancient video here. The USSR didn't experience the same problems of the US during the Great Depression, mainly because it didn't have private property or a stock exchange, and Soviet citizens didn't have much savings following many years of destabilization efforts and civil war funded by other powers. In the USSR, 1929 was the beginning of the first 5-year plan, when advanced construction and manufacturing methods, assembly lines, and making petroproducts were first introduced en masse. In fact, 56% of investment went into heavy industry. Because of this focus, they directed 70% of iron and steel output and 86% of machinery output into more means of industrial output. These producer goods were, however, only 23% of the total, with the remaining 77% coming from agriculture and light industry, with examples like textiles. This was possible in part because the USSR was able to go from having over 1 million unemployed people, plus hundreds of thousands in seasonal unemployment, and that's only the official figures, to practically none. Back to the video in just a minute. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Proton Mail. Freedom is impossible without privacy, but in the United States, your private emails, texts, and calls might not be so private. Thanks to Section 702 of the FISA Amendment Act, intelligence agencies can collect data on foreign nationals, but there's a backdoor that lets them surveil people in the United States as well. And it's not just the NSA. Federal and even local law enforcement can access personal data from third parties without a warrant. This means that your emails, your texts, and your calls are all vulnerable. That's where Proton Mail comes in. Take control of your privacy by clicking my link in the description box and downloading Proton's free encrypted email service to protect your identity online. Proton is built with privacy at its core. Headquartered in Switzerland, it's protected by some of the world's strongest privacy laws that make it illegal for Swiss companies to cooperate with foreign surveillance. This means that in principle, no government can force Proton to hand over your emails. And beyond legal protections, Proton uses end-to-end encryption, meaning your emails are locked before they even reach Proton servers. Not even Proton can read them. And it's not just email. Proton Drive, Proton Pass, and Proton Calendar all use zero-access encryption, ensuring your files, passwords, and schedules stay yours and yours alone. In a world where governments and corporations constantly look for ways to access your data, privacy shouldn't be a luxury, it should be the default. Join over 100 million people taking control of their online privacy with Proton. Get started for free using my link, proton.me/Hakeem. Thanks to Proton Mail for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is much appreciated. Alright, back to the video. During the first 5-year plan, the number of salaried workers doubled. 3.5 million women entered the workforce at all levels, and 8.6 million rural people became employed in industry. Over 5 years, the USSR eradicated unemployment and its underlying causes. A planned labor system now replaced spontaneous migration, training specialists, recruiting rural workers systematically, and improving skills to address full-scale industrialization demands. The many decaying local industrial bases, from the US to Europe, and the many that never got off the ground because of colonialism and IMF restructuring in Bangladesh to Kenya, would greatly benefit from this mass mobilization of workers into active and productive labor, resulting in tremendous economic and social gains. The reason it isn't done in capitalist countries is because full employment shifts bargaining power to the workers when agitating for better conditions, which is why the reserve army of labor and perpetual unemployment is a thing under capitalism. Watch my 101 videos for more if you're interested. Socialist countries' ability to withstand crises is compelling, but they also must meet people's daily needs. And while price controls get a bad rap in mainstream media, They are a major tool of a larger needs-based approach that actually works, and counter to the World Bank's profit-driven method for alleviating poverty. It works so well that when push comes to shove, the United States economy also applies them. Price controls in planned economies aren't really controls per se, though. Countries like Vietnam have subsidized goods on the market at times instead. So there's a range of what has been historically done. Likewise, there are price controls under capitalism. They're just set to higher than what most people are comfortable paying for the interests of profit, of course. In the same vein, rationing also exists in capitalist countries, but that's a conversation for another day. Let's look at some price controls in action to see how they work. Starting with Vietnam's strict control over rice, accounting for at least 75% of Vietnamese people's caloric intake. Prices are set on the producer side, allowing the government to keep prices low and raise money by the buying and selling of rice. This comfortable control allows for protections from major shocks like natural disasters, market shifts, or the sudden emergence of new technologies. In Singapore, not a socialist country, similar procedures helped control housing prices, which made housing much more affordable, allowing for social stability. India, also not a socialist nation, used price controls for medicine, making it available to a massive proportion of the population. They set maximum selling prices, which prevents pharmaceutical companies price gouging. Why does this matter? Well, achieving decent living standards globally for 8.5 billion people would only require 30% of current resource and energy use if managed properly. This requires central planning of public services, efficient technology, and industrial development. Profit-first production can't compete because it wasn't even meant to win the efficiency game. It was built for profit. Social systems consistently deliver better physical quality of life and more health professionals per capita because of public investment, planning, and equitable access. Price controls at strategic intervals and on strategic goods or inputs for public interest rather than profit are just one tool here. If we move the conversation to that of planning inputs and organizing production outside of the market, socialist nations did that just as well, if not better than market systems. And I've discussed this in more detail in my economic calculations video here. Educate yourself. Most of what you've heard about socialism is unsourced sound bites aimed at keeping you ignorant because Amazon and the American weapons industry needs more profit. I mentioned earlier that part of the reason for the higher quality of life in socialist states was because they provided their citizens universal healthcare. In the USSR, healthcare was a right and was provided for free. Between 1940 and 1969, the USSR made substantial gains in child height, birth weight, adult height, and infant mortality, 4 key indicators of population health and living standards. Cuba, too, considered healthcare a human right and provides healthcare to citizens for free while spending 1/20th what the US spends per capita, delivering a longer life expectancy. Cuba practices social medicine that deals with the underlying conditions that lead to poor health, meaning preventive care. Also, rather than waiting for sick people to go to the doctor, which they can do too, nurses walk around assigned districts with equipment in hand, visiting homes to check the health of the inhabitants. Cuba has also launched massive vaccination programs which eliminated polio, tetanus, diphtheria, measles, whooping cough, and rubella, while nearly eradicating typhoid fever and tuberculosis. These campaigns have achieved 99% childhood vaccination coverage, far exceeding the terrifyingly low US rate of 70%. If that wasn't enough, Cuba's contribution to global medical aid is more than all so-called developed nations combined, saving over 2 million people and deploying over 130,000 personnel to 107 countries. All this time, I didn't once bring up the US embargo, which I'll cover later, despite which they have accomplished almost all of this. This is objectively extremely impressive, and no capitalist country has, can, or will accomplish anything similar under similar conditions. 2 notable retorts people here are: 1. Social democratic countries have universal healthcare, and 2. North Korean height. Concerning the first, the only reason universal healthcare was developed in those, for example, European countries, is because of the threat of communist electoral victory or general influence. Every year, these systems are further gutted, defunded, or privatized from Britain to France and Scandinavia. Any proper and sustained universal healthcare system needs a socialist government which values human life over profits. You can dive deeper into the issues of social democracy here. Regarding the second, well, yes, heights were different from the 90s onwards between the DPRK and South Korea because of malnutrition. Why was there malnutrition in the DPRK? Well, bad timing of weather conditions and drought, coinciding with the disappearance of the DPRK's largest trading partner, the USSR, along with strategic yet broad sanctions by the largest military power to ever exist, aimed at instigating famine and preventing any recovery. These sanctions still harm the DPRK to this day. And this context is never given. I wonder why. Watch my DPRK video for more here. Another reason for the higher quality of life in social states was because they provided their citizens free education, starting with eradicating illiteracy and all the way up to postdoc studies. At the start of the 20th century, under the Tsar, only 22% of Russians were literate. Those in the quote-unquote periphery republics had even worse rates. The state of education in the USSR after World War I and the Civil War was terrible, precisely because it was practically non-existent, a legacy of the Tsarist era. And yet, by 1939, the literacy rate had reached 81%. A couple of decades later, it was basically 100. But they didn't just teach people to read. The literacy program also taught people how to take notes, as well as giving guidance and recommendations on how to and what to read. In pre-revolutionary Cuba, 25% of kids 10 and older never enrolled in school. Another 50% dropped out before graduating from elementary school, and only 20% went on to education beyond primary. The revolutionary tackled this problem immediately. Just 2 years after the revolution, in January of 1961, they launched the National Literacy Campaign, and by summer had a 178,000-strong literacy army of paid teachers whose job was to scour the countryside and rural areas and teach people to read. In just 1 year, 700,000 Cubans were able to read and write at least at a first-grade level, which reduced illiteracy in the country to 3.9%, lower than any other Latin American country.
And I talked to a guy in Havana who says to me, before, all I used to see here in Havana, you call this drab and dull, we see it as a cleaner city. It's true, you got the paint is peeling off the walls, but you don't see kids begging in the streets anymore. And today, this man is going to night school. He said, I can read. I can read. Do you know what it means to be able to read? Do you know what it means to be able not to read?
Let's look at the unemployment and pension systems in Cuba and Vietnam. Quick note for Americans, in Cuba a pension is like your social security system. It's for retirement. The amount of their pensions is determined based on the average of the 5 highest earning years selected from the previous 15 prior to applying, allowing people to have an average that is up to 90% of their salary. They also have a provision for an extraordinary age pension, added on top of their regular pension, that grants 40% of salary for 20 years of service and 2% added for every year above that. If you're disabled and require assistance to perform daily activities, your pension amounts go up by 20%. Unemployment in Cuba has many worker protections. The subsidy has a floor. It can't be less than 50% of the current minimum wage. If a worker is hospitalized due to an illness or non-work-related accident, they get 50% of the average salary. However, if it's work-related, it goes up to 70%. If this illness or injury doesn't require hospitalization, the allowance is 60%. If it's a work-related illness or accident, they get 80%. One of the coolest provisions says that if a worker performs a heroic act, meaning saving lives while on the job or protecting social property from destruction, for example, the amount of the subsidy or pension is increased by 20%, with an upper limit of 90%. In Vietnam, workers can expect not only money, but the law requires them to receive consulting and job introduction support, vocational training for new and existing skills, amongst others. Of course, nothing is unlimited, and unemployment benefits aren't allowed to exceed 5 times the minimum wage. But crucially, they can be 5 times the minimum wage, which is still really good. Public transit and walkable spaces tend to greatly improve quality of life, and China might be the best. As of 2024, public networks serve 90% of the urban population, something no Western country or city can lay claim to. In 2022, their system served 12 billion passengers, showing more people are relying on public transit. Their high-speed rail network, the largest in the world, commands 40,000 kilometers, enough to just about wrap around the Earth's equator. China also has 1.5 million buses serving at least 10 billion people annually. All this public transit has helped China meet climate change goals by reducing emissions by 30% over the last 5 years, and helps people save 25% of their monthly budget. All of this, obviously, contributes greatly to quality of life, cleaner air, places to go, and ways to get there. It's self-evident that housing is a major component of having a better quality of life, and socialist countries delivered. I have an upcoming video on this, so keep an eye out. In Yugoslavia, they used prefabrication to produce 150,000 high-quality apartments all over the world. Despite being prefabricated, they were designed to give architects the ability to experiment with floor plans and facade designs. Residents enjoyed apartments designed for adaptable living and psychological well-being, featuring long sight lines to windows, abundant natural light, and no cramped spaces. Ironically, these are now considered luxury features, and yet were achieved decades ago, on a huge scale, providing housing for the working class by the working class, especially after a devastating war. In Albania, after World War II, 62,000 homes, or 25% of the total housing stock, was destroyed. Development and planning of new housing was centrally controlled by the state, part of the 5-year plans, One important kind of housing they used was based on a Chinese prefabrication model designed for housing near factories and pumped out to 2,000 apartments per year. Albania was an incredibly poor country in Europe, and still is, and neither was it a good example of socialism, but it managed this much. In Romania, another not that great example of socialism, high-quality mass housing began being built during the 1960s in larger cities, achieving a broad mix of classes amongst residents, like in Albania, with generous green spaces that remain desirable to residents even today. These large-scale developments were a universal form of urban living, with some estates like
Gheorgheni, Cluj,
housing over 30,000, or
Titan Balta Albă,
planned for a whopping 220,000 residents. At the same time, intensive industrialization and massive rural-urban migration was underway. By the mid-1970s, rural immigrants made up about 75% of residents. This raised peasants' living condition to urban standards, resetting the social structure to one based on worker solidarity and community. Back to Cuba, in the early 90s, following the illegal and undemocratic dissolution of their largest trading partner, the USSR, an agricultural collapse occurred, caused in part by extreme industrial dependency and heavy imports. Around 90% of inputs and 57% of calories were imported. By 1993, Cubans were getting 30% fewer calories in their diet. However, within a mere decade, thanks to state programs, Cuba doubled production and increased caloric availability by 25%. This success came from prioritizing equitable food access over profits, showing that equitable distribution, a requirement of true food security, was possible even for a poor nation under crippling sanctions. Similarly, post-World War II USSR attained food security through rationing, abolished in 1949, while reducing prices and raising wages. Keep in mind, rationing was a thing all across Europe at the time. The 1950s saw annual increases in meat and dairy, vegetable, fish, and sugar consumption in the USSR, alongside decreased bread and potato reliance, the usual indication of rising living standards. It increased to the point that even the CIA admitted, in secret notes of course, that Soviet and American diets are basically not too different. Socialist states have also delivered decisive, large-scale improvements in water access and sanitation. China's state-directed social improvement initiatives require that people have adequate food and clothing, education, healthcare, safe housing, and of course, access to safe drinking water, all of which they provide for over 382 million rural people, and by 2020 achieved 83% tap water coverage in poor areas. Additionally, they invested billions into a successful national toilet revolution, which dramatically improved sanitation for over 95% of villages. As funny as it sounds, getting toilet and sanitation access to hundreds of millions of people over a massive and diverse geographic terrain is no easy feat. That's why India has never managed, but China has. Similarly, Cuba's revolutionary government addressed pre-revolutionary rural neglect. Only 15% had running water versus 80% in the cities. This was quickly solved by constructing vast housing projects with integrated amenities in both urban and rural communities. In contrast, the World Bank's water schemes imposed on Vietnam made it reliant on private capital, with fragmented results. While serving 180,000 people, 93% of households connected only after substantial subsidies reduced fees, which still left 28,000 households unserved or stuck with systems that malfunctioned within months. I've talked about the US enforcing a trade embargo on Vietnam in my video about why they hate the US here, so I'll be light on the details. In short, the US blocked all commercial transactions, including investments and goods with over 10% US content, under threat of severe penalties. This, combined with the US veto on lending by the IMF and the World Bank, prevented Vietnam from getting crucial loans for large-scale infrastructure projects, trade, and attracting investment. Vietnam's access to foreign aid by the late 1980s averaged a meager $75 million annually, so basically nothing. However, the embargo also denied US firms access, which eventually created opportunities for European and Pacific Asian states to secure oil contracts and carve out a market for themselves. The end of the embargo in 1994 resulted in a dramatic economic surge and brought a 6.5-fold increase in foreign aid, while trade doubled from $3.6 billion to $8.2 billion from 1988 to 1993, and foreign investment exploded from $364 million to $11 billion. The US's embargo and sanctions against Vietnam were judged on paper to be an outright failure in achieving their stated policy goals, but they did what they were intended to do, to impoverish the Vietnamese population in hopes that they would rise up in arms against their socialist government. That failed, of course. The vast majority of other socialist nations were not allowed the privilege of foreign investment or open trade internationally, resulting in the usually much smaller nations suffering under economic sanctions imposed on them by the US. The idea is that countries on the international stage can either trade with, for example, tiny Cuba or the United States, the by many factors larger population and economy-wise nation, making the choice a no-brainer to any third party. More on sanctions can be seen in my video covering Cuba here. Despite heavy wartime losses, and what you've likely heard, the Soviet Union achieved rapid post-war recovery in consumer goods production, exceeding pre-war industrial outputs by 1950 through conversion of armament factories to manufacturing consumer goods. Output surged from the 1950s and 60s, especially for clothing items. Leather footwear went from 272 million to 456 million pairs, knitwear from 18 million to 104 million, socks and stockings from 500 million pairs to 1.3 billion over just a few short years. By the early 1960s, access to daily necessities was more or less certain for urban and rural people. This enabled further advances. By 1973, ownership of new tech rose, with steadily rising ownership of radios, TVs, refrigerators, and washing machines. It may not have been as high as it would be in a modern Western country now, which does sound restrictive, but you need to realize the sheer backwardness of Tsarist Russia's economy, combined with the Herculean scale of destruction caused by the Civil War and World War II, and also that we're talking almost a century ago. Soviet growth was staggering, despite all of these burdens, something no capitalist nation has replicated, historically or in the modern day. Cuba achieved significant success against COVID-19 despite sanctions. They developed 3 COVID-19 vaccine candidates with over 90% effectiveness, which they'd administered many millions of doses to its population of just 11 million people. This massive campaign resulted in a vaccination rate of 93%. Vietnam showed the whole world how to properly care for citizens during the height of the pandemic. When Ho Chi Minh City imposed a lockdown, residents received essential goods delivered by military personnel, with separate initiatives for vulnerable groups, mobilizing 2,000 military medics and 30,000 militia. Binh Duong province provided even more support. Free rice to 720,000 residents in its most affected areas, distributing 5,700 tons of rice and a daily stipend to everybody on top. This isn't even getting into the poverty alleviation bit, which tried lifting an unprecedented 800 million people out of extreme poverty over 40 years. This is close to 75% of the global reduction in extreme poverty, and achieved the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development target 10 years early. One image that comes to most Western minds when price controls come up is the empty shelves meme. Here's a quote from the Economic Times. Empty shelves and job layoffs are warning signs that the US economy could slide into a recession by the summer of 2025. Capitalism causing empty shelves. Who would have thunk? Or during COVID, when shelves stood empty all across the wealthiest nation on Earth. Some will retort, but that was during a pandemic. Sure, fine. If that's a good enough excuse for the United States, why isn't industrial sabotage, economic sanctions, and funnily enough, market reforms imposed on formerly planned economic systems an excuse for the exceptional and solitary incidents of empty shelves in, for example, the last few years of the USSR? You don't need to answer this. This is just an exercise in critical thinking. No country is perfect, and neither were the historic attempts as well as the current attempts at building socialism. There's tons to criticize, and there's an appetizer on that topic in an earlier video here. The thing is, none of them had the luxury of unimpeded or independent development, the way the United States has and had. It kind of goes back to that old meme. Socialism always fails. That's why the CIA and State Department spends billions cooing, assassinating, invading, sabotaging, isolating, and threatening socialist nations. Watch my earlier video for more. Hopefully it's clear by now, and with the previous videos, that socialist countries are superior in delivering a better quality of life, often on remarkably short timescales. Turns out that people work very hard to improve their circumstances if they're given the opportunity to fully participate in how their society functions, and not only to serve profit. A better world is possible. That's all for today. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you too.